Hello everybody and welcome to another hobby cheating video. This is part 2 of us painting the awesome new Dark Elf from the Cult of Paint Kickstarter. Again, you can see some also content for the High Elf side if you like that sort of thing over on Ninjon's channel. But today we're going to deep dive a specific topic. We're going to talk all about scale mail. This is very specific, but for those of you who need it, I'm very excited. Let's get into it.
The strict technomancer that is Vinci V. Let us get to the technique and learn it Vinci V style.
One of the most common questions I get on my Patreon, by the way, you can find the link below if you want to check it out, is all about non-metallic metal. Non-metallic metal itself is a fairly complicated thing to unpack, but where it gets really complicated is when you have any kind of segmented structure that you're trying to paint it on. For example, scale mail, one of the most common things we paint on a lot of our fantasy figures. So today we're going to break it down into its individual elements to really help you understand how to think about light. Let's head over to the painting desk and let's get painting. So the first thing to say is let's just look at this surface. Now, this is on the light side of my miniature where it's highlighted, so that's what I'm going to use here. The other side of the miniature, the other scale mails are going to be largely in much bluer highlight tones, so we're going to focus on this because this is more traditional lighting like you would expect. The first thing to understand about highlights is that light in general on the areas of your miniature needs to move like the little red bar in the Price is Right game. Your value spectrum runs from like 1 to 10, okay? And so at any point in time, if you're using 1, then your lowest value in that area, other than like extremely deep recesses or something that's completely hidden, should be like a 4 or a 5. So 1 is the brightest, 4 or 5 is somewhere in the midtone. If you're in the shadow area, then that same midtone, 5, 6, somewhere in there, is your highlight color. The little red bar moves around just like the Price is Right game. It can't be the whole bar all at once. This is a sort of complicated thing to understand when you first hear it, but it's really simple once you lock it in your head. If you're painting your brightest highlight, then the midtone, the shadow of that area is the midtone. If you're painting your deepest shadow, the highlight of that area is the midtone, and then in the middle you're somewhere in between. The next thing we need to understand about painting scale mail is that the area of the mail, the first way we want to think about it is as the total volume. So, in other words, pretend those scales weren't there. If this was just a big flat thing, what would you do? Would you make 100 little individual highlights, which is how I always see people highlight scale mail. They highlight like the rim edge of every scale and then, kind of do some lights down toward the bottom equally across the entire scale mail. Not how it works. Pretend it's flat. You would have an area of highlight, an area of shadow, and then a bounce light. That's what would happen. So we're going to do the same thing here. Only we're then going to pay attention to the micro volumes and have each little scale move and scintillate in that way. This whole video I work with no more than 2 paints. This is a Payne's Gray and an Ice Yellow. That's it. It is very simple. But you can do this with any kind of 2 tones. You need a base tone for the metal and a highlight color. It's completely irrelevant what paints you use. Okay, step 1 is we're going to get a base tone down across all of the areas that are going to have any kind of light on them at all. So we're going to be pretty heavy with this. So on the broad area of the main panel there in between the 2 purple armor plates and then the bounce light down below under his leg. Those get treated with the Payne's Gray over the black. There's not that much of the sort of initial zenithal I did that got down here. A little bit, but whatever. We're turning those all that tone. Okay? That's number 1. Then I'm going to start incorporating the ice yellow. And I work in very thin ratios, adding a small amount, and then a little more, 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 and then eventually I get to pure ice yellow. So that's the progression. It's just like 10%, 20%, 30%, 50%, something like that, right? Okay. So then I highlight a smaller area within there. Again, just like traditional laying, you're layering. I am not paying any attention to the scales at this point, right? I'm just getting down where the central area of new highlight is. Again, across that middle, and then in the bounce light down toward the bottom. So the bounce light, the normal lights are coming from the top where his thigh is pressing out. The bottom lights are coming from, the bounce light is coming from the bottom where it would bounce up from the ground, because, that's how the ground works. And so once that's in there, now and only then once we have our first progressions do we start working in individual scales. And you actually wouldn't have to start there yet. You could keep going, filling in light and light and light. But here I'm going to start working. But I'm still working quite broadly. So across the individual scales in the primary light area, I integrate a little more ice yellow. And I start from the top. This is the next thing I'm going to say. Scales should be highlighted from the top, not at the bottom. Highlights are at the top and the sticky outy bits. This is a flat plane. There's no sticky outy bits, so it's the top. Okay? So our scale starts from the top. In the primary highlight area, you'll notice I'm just covering the whole scale. And then as I get to the edge of that, based on where I put my previous 2 layers, I am then slowly covering less and less and leaving a little bit of that at the bottoms of the scales. Okay? And I do the same thing in reverse in the bounce light area. I then add in a little more. Yet again, going from the top. This is really just like technique-wise, this couldn't be more simple. It is traditional layering. I'm just working thin with very thin paints and building it up. Okay? But the key is, on these scales, the highlights are centered towards, because from the light from above, on the primary leg scale, the scales are lit towards the top. In the bounce light areas, that's where they're lit towards the bottom, because they're lit towards the source of the light. The light's bouncing off the ground, the bottom of the scale is closer to the ground, that's where the light goes. On the top of the scale is closer to the sky, where the light is, hence, that's where the light is. Okay? And I continue this practice, adding in more and more ice yellow, and each time, you'll notice, less of each scale gets covered. So as my sphere of light shrinks, right, down, because I'm getting to higher value into the primary light on the scales, I'm leaving little bits of the previous layers exposed on more and more scales. I also don't take that bright light to all of the scales. You notice I'm covering less and less and less each time, until for some of them, they're just very thin light edges. Now, why am I doing the top edge of the scale in addition to the bottom edges on those sort of as we expand out from the sphere? Because the scale that's right above it would have an edge highlight that will catch and reflect light. And if it's reflecting light, then it would bounce to the scale next to it, and you would see that reflection of that light in the one right above it. Okay? Or below it, sorry. So that's why I'm just on the edges of that, covering less and less. So effectively, the way to think about this is you started by covering every scale all the way, right? Then you covered a slightly smaller zone all the way, and then a slightly smaller zone all the way, but extended that light a little bit onto just the tops of whatever the ring around that is. Shrunk it again, that's the top of the next ring. Shrunk it again, the top of the next ring, right? So each scale, as we progress towards the primary point of light, has less and less and less of that bright light and extends more into the shadow color. Eventually, I end by putting, a very bright, basically primary light in pure ice yellow on just a few scales in the center of the area, not covering everything. So there's still some transition even across those extremely bright scales, but it's minimal. We need to sell the NMM effect across the whole scale skirt. We do not need to sell it on every single scale. So we have to run the full contrast here, but we don't have to run the full contrast on each scale. So once that's done, my next step is to make sure that I have all my edges properly picked out and in place. And this can be annoying with your edge highlighting because you can't always, you can't work the side of the brush really. Sometimes you have to just paint a thin line. It's no problem. If your line is a little fat, you come back in with the shadow color and smooth out towards the edge. I made a video about this previously, about how to cheat with edge highlights. Now, the reason I don't universally highlight every edge in the same tone, just like with the primary highlight, the edge highlights also travel in value. So at the hottest point where there's the most light, those are in basically pure ice yellow. As I go into the shadow, more and more of that Payne's gray is incorporated. So when I'm in the deepest shadows, the edge highlights there are really are still pretty dark comparatively, like darker than anything that's in the highlight area. Again, that little red bar keeps moving. So in my shadow area, my highlight is like a 5 or a 6 on the value scale because the shadow color is a 10. It's basically black. Some of the scales are still basically black, or almost completely in shadow. So that's where I then focus in, getting those edges nice and knocked in and cleaning them up. But there's one more important trick to selling scale mail. This is the secret tech. As always, if you watched till this point, you're the real hero. Comment down below so I can know if you watched. Tell me something that you got to this point. Maybe, I don't know, just say pickles. Right? There you go. Just say pickles. That's fine. Then I'll know you got to this point and you're a real hero. Okay, so on that, I'm going to take some pure ice yellow, and at the top center of every scale, basically where it gets hidden between the other two scales, I'm going to put a small dot of that ice yellow in right there, all across the thing. Now again, when I get into the deepest shadows, I will mix in some of the blue, and so on and so forth. It's not the same color across the thing, but you get my point. I'm using quite a bright highlight here, even in the shadow areas, slightly brighter than anything else. This is our little specular highlight for the small piece of metal that holds the scale in place, the little ring that's holding that in place. What this does is really sell the overall thing. I really can't explain why this works so well as a visual trick, but adding in those small little dots at the top center of the scale, again, you vary the value slightly, but adding that in really does make it pop out like scale mail. I can't explain why. It just is what works. I know it works. I assume because our brains have noticed that in real scale mail we've seen in our lives, because those little rings do reflect light, they're very shiny. And so I assume that's basically your brain goes, yeah, that's credible, that's correct. So, at any rate, that's scale mail in detail. I know 13 minutes on something so hyper-specific is weird, and frankly, I am probably the only channel that would make a video like this, because if you're watching to this point, you're one of the few. I know this won't be a super popular video, and thank you very much if you do watch this. I really can't explain how much I appreciate it. I make these because I want people to have answers to these challenging questions that they have. I want there to be a resource for them that if you run into this, you can search, you can know. So, if you liked this, do please give it a like. It helps other people find the video. Subscribe for new hobby cheating. Don't forget, down in the description below, you can check out the link for the new Kickstarter from Call to Paint if you want to pick up some of these awesome elves for yourself. We'll be back next week with part 3 on this figure, so I do hope you stay with me. Because next week we're going to talk all about cold highlights and how to make something look like it's both in shadow but also still visually interesting and having a cool light. So we're going to finish the figure next week. I'm really excited about it. This fig has been so much fun to paint, and I thank you so much for coming along on the journey. While you're down there in the description checking out the Kickstarter, why not also check out the affiliate links down there? Those, if you're picking up your hobby supplies, they don't cost you anything extra. In fact, they often save you money, and they give an awesome kickback to the channel. It really helps us a lot. There's also, of course, things like the books Uncle Adam and I make. If you're looking for your new hobby obsession, we've got some great games down there. As well, there is also our Patreon. If you want to take your next step on your hobby journey, we would love to have you as part of the community. As always, though, thank you so much for watching this one, and we'll see you next time.